Hello, hello. For those who just joined, we are still allowing like 1 minute for participants. We have already 40 people, so let's keep some time for anyone late to join, and then we'll kick off with the webinar. So please give us some time. In the meantime, I have launched a poll, so kindly please use it to tell us where are you from, because we would like to know where our audience are from, and if you are like very new to the topic or you are already certified in Kanban, this will allow us to have some insights of our beloved audience. Okay, I see some replies are coming, and it's already 4 minutes past 6 p.m. So I think we can kick off. Um, Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's Janek Radzikowski from David J. Anderson School of Management. I'm very pleased to have you all here today. We have a great guest, Annette Vendelbo, who will show us some practical aspects of implementing Kanban on the webinar, which is called From Kanban Maturity Level 0 to 2 in 8 months. So this will be a great opportunity to hear uh, from this professional how practically implementing Kanban looks like company in international company, which may be more demanding than usual. So I'm not taking more time from Annette. I will give her a voice in a second. In the meantime, please use the Q&A chat to submit your questions. I will be trying to pick them up during the webinar and tell Annette that we have something. If not, then we will have Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So feel free to submit anything you would like to ask Annette. Annette, the floor is yours. The mic is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I've been looking so much forward to being here. For me, it's in the very late afternoon, but good morning, good evening, good whatever the time is where you're sitting. And also thank you to David J. Anderson School of Management for inviting me to present this webinar, which is a case study from a company called One.com, a global company. And I've been looking very much forward to present something from the real world rather than from a theoretical point of view, which is what I usually do. So now let's dig into it and let's look at what happened in reality at this company. Just a very few words about myself. I formed my own company some 15 years ago, and since then I've been working only with agile systems, but my heart is beating heavily for the Kanban method, and this is what I enjoy most working with. My foundation originally was IT project management, and I haven't really left my roots because I still work with Project Management Institute, where I participate in their global agile initiatives, and I'm also one of the global people writing new questions for their certification exams. But other than that, let's just move on. I'll start with presenting the agenda here. First of all, what happened when we started to shape the change journey, what happened when we executed the transformation, and what was the outcome of this execution. And then I'll finish off with a summary of what we learned. So starting with shaping the change journey. In fact, everything here started with a podcast episode. And I was contacted via LinkedIn by a vice president of product development at One.com. And the reason that he contacted me was that Group One, which is the parent company of One.com, they had acquired a company from the Netherlands. And he felt that it was time to look at a common way of working to get people in sync and get a common language across the company. This VP had heard a podcast episode. I have my own podcast. And here, as usual, I'm almost tempted to say I talked about the Kanban method and the good things that would happen if you use the method. And what he came across that he liked particularly was the fact that it's quite simple, it's pragmatic, and you can avoid those productivity dips that you usually will see when you start implementing something new. And therefore, he wanted to know more, and he invited me for a meeting. Of course, I accepted to participate in a meeting with him, but this was where it all started. And before I continue here going through the case study, let me introduce you to our Agile six-pack, which is in fact the implementation approach that I always use. And as I mentioned before, I've been working with Agile systems in many different ways over the past 15 years. And over time, I realized that if you wanted to have a successful implementation, you need to have a playbook and you need to embark on this agile transformation in a structured way. Otherwise, it can go any which way. So this is what I started working with steps 1 and 2 being the mobilization workshops, or mobilization being the starting point, then the execution with steps 3 and 4, and then continuing with the improvement journey, steps 5 and 6. And what comes out of the first few meetings is a kind of a roadmap where we discuss, so what do we need to get into step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Not always do we get to step 6, but that's a different story. What also come out of this clarifying meeting is a calendar. It's quite detailed so that people get a feel for what do I get when I engage with Agile Agenda and when we start working on this transformation. So this is just to give you the kind of context of this transformation and the way it was carried out. But back to the meeting with the vice president, we had a Teams meeting, and I went through some of the building blocks of the Kanban method, and the VP was outlining the situation and the problems that he would like to get solved. We were also discussing various implementation approaches. It's not like I always work with Kanban, although this is what I prefer to do. And we were trying to figure out, do we have a match here? Will I be a good match for One.com? And is Kanban also a good match for One.com? And during this step, this first meeting, the purpose was to set the direction. But before going into more details about that, let's look at our scope here. One.com is a global company, and the vice president had developers sitting in Norway, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, and also in India. But in this case, our scope was Denmark and the newly acquired company in the Netherlands. It was kind of a pilot. So the discussions at this first meeting, it was, okay, so what are your difficulties? How are you working now? What do you want to achieve? If you don't know where people want to go, how can you set a good direction? And why do you think that Kanban might be the right choice for this product development department in One.com? We also touched about the Kanban maturity model to try and see, so when we are talking about improvements, would it be a good thing to lean on the KMM going through this maturity journey? We also talked about what would be realistic to gain, what expectations could we be setting, and what goals could we be putting up in front of ourselves. And I was not afraid to promise a 10% gain in productivity because I've seen quite more than that on other implementations. And since we were within the scope of the VP's control, I also believe that it would be feasible and possible to move the organization, the Danish and the Dutch organization, from their current state to maturity level 2. And that, of course, is not my doing, because I'm not moving the organization. The organization is moving the organization. But under conditions that that people would be working with me, I would not be afraid to promise a move to MO2. The next step that came out of this was that we agreed that Kanban would be a good choice for one.com, probably the best. And we also agreed that we need to onboard the management team, because they're playing a vital role. People managers of the teams that were going to be part of this implementation, they are playing an instrumental role in such a change. So we wanted to onboard the management team. So this was our second meeting in the mobilization part of this six-pack. What we did was to share the content that we had discussed, the VP and I, and then I also gave a brief introduction to the Kanban method. Kanban was new to them. I don't know your experiences, but my experience is that many people think that they know Kanban, but once you start digging into the method and try and discuss the different building blocks, people realize, maybe I don't know Kanban that well. So I gave them a brief introduction to what Kanban is, and we also talked about the big transparency that Kanban is offering, and also how the system itself is preventing people from getting overburdened. Also, we talked about the evolutionary approach, which I see as a failure mitigator. The fact that you're not doing too many things at the same time, it makes things kind of seep in and become good habits instead. So I see that as a failure mitigator. And what they also loved was the data-driven and also the very transparent approach that Kanban is offering. And we also talked about what they could expect to gain, and that would not be only the 10% gain that I talked about prior or just before, and it wouldn't just be moving the maturity levels, but also in terms of overburdening stakeholder management and collaboration and stuff like that. What could they expect to gain? And then why would we put such a big emphasis on onboarding the management team from this very start? Well, the reason for that is that if they are not onboarded and if they don't agree on this approach, we're probably not going to get their active support. And their active support is so much needed when you want to do something of a transformation like this. And you might also run the risk that if they don't understand what we're trying to do, they might act in ways that would actually disturb what we were trying to achieve and impede the use of Kanban. And also, when we're talking about the management team here, they're talking to managers above themselves, or they're talking with managers in different business units. And if they don't know enough about what we're trying to achieve, they won't be able to support the implementation and to talk to higher level managers, explain the rationale behind it. So these are reasons why it's so important when you're trying to do a transformation that you do have the managers on board. On top of what we already discussed, the VP and I, concerning the obstacles in Group 1, the management team had more obstacles that they would like to see removed. The maturity in the teams varied, and so did the outcome. So they were seeing a bit of unpredictability in service delivery, and they would like to see more predictability in the way that the teams were working. There was also a matter of shared resources, which is usually the case. And in this case, I would like to point out the testers. They were sitting in a team of their own, but they were not aligned in terms of the priorities with the development teams. So that meant that when stuff was sent for testing to the testing team, there might be wait times because they were doing something else, and the new work was sitting in the pile of the work that they already had, and that resulted in those long lead times. And they would like to kind of reduce those lead times to get faster service delivery. And one of the problems that we were facing was many stakeholders to each team, and they were fighting for the same resources, and they were not aligned again concerning the priorities. So it was every stakeholder for himself. This resulted in many escalations and reprioritizations because the teams might think that now we have the priorities in order, but then one stakeholder would realize, well, these guys are not working on my things, so I need to talk to the team's managers, and escalation started and meetings were held, and then the result of this was new priorities. So the teams were task switching. And one thing that also met these teams was that they were often asked for things that were not clearly described, and therefore the developers, they had to guess. Usually it might be an educated guess, but not always. Sometimes they guess wrong, and this would result in rework of what they have done. And also, as I briefly mentioned before, those developers, they were doing things each their way on the team level, meaning that they were not talking the same language. So the managers, the management team, they would like to see a common way of working because they found that it was missing. So depending on which team they were speaking to, they would have a different way of talking about the same things, and that made it difficult to communicate. So they would like to see a common way of working and a common language in all of these teams. But long story short, we agreed on the journey, and everyone was very confident that Kanban would be the right way to work, and we should start the implementation. We also wanted to cause as little disruption as possible, because it is the experience that when you are doing agile transformations, you will often experience a big dip in productivity because you are disturbing many different things at the same time, changing a lot of things, changing the organization, roles and responsibilities, and many other things. But the management team said we need to cause as little disruption as possible because we need to be able to deliver stably throughout the transformation. And then we plan to onboard the team leads at the very starting point, because just as the management team are key to help this transformation get on the way and support the whole change, the same goes for the team leads, which were actually the change agents. And that reminds me that I want to point out that the material you see in this presentation, it's all been agreed with the key people from one.com that has put their thumbs up and said, yes, this is exactly what happened. So this was just to remind myself to mention that this is not my presentation. It's a joint effort between the key people from one.com and myself. And last but not least, the strategy that we decided on was to coach the coaches. The aim was to make the team leads as self-sufficient as possible, as quickly as possible. It's not important that I can stand up and explain that I know a lot about Kanban. The important thing is that those team leads were able to front the teams and to do whatever needed to be done in their teams. And then I would coach them kind of behind the scenes. And that worked out very well. I mentioned the calendar before, and this is exactly the calendar that we were working to at one.com, where you can see there is a legend where the green is coaching activity, the blue is training and workshop activity, and then the yellow, that's holidays. So this was to make it very clear, what do we intend to do during these months ahead of us in this transformation, and also agree on the milestones. Milestone 1, all training has been completed. Milestone 2, all teams have started measure throughput and lead times and report them 2 times per month, and so on and so forth, so that the management team and the VP and the company on a whole, they would know that if we engage on this journey, this is what we can expect to get out of it. As you may notice, there are a couple of milestones, 3.2 and 4.2. It has to do with the maturity assessment, Agile Agenda's maturity assessment for Kanban, that we also introduced to be able to monitor the improvement journey that all these teams went through. And I'm going to touch a bit upon that later as well. So onboarding the team leads. At this point in time, the decision had been made. We were going to go for Kanban, and that was not open for discussion. But we wanted to explain to those team leads why did we decide to go Kanban, and also, yeah, the rationale behind it and what changes were lying ahead of us. Also, giving them an introduction to the Kanban method, what it is and what it's not, just like we did with the management team. Again, because there are quite a few misunderstandings about what Kanban is, so let's get the story straight from the start and let them understand what this is all about. And also, this was an opportunity for them to express their skepticism, if any. And also, we could discuss anything that they would like to discuss, anything on their minds. What we wanted to ensure was that they would be true change agents, that they really wanted this change and were willing to support it, because otherwise nothing much will happen if we don't have the team leads that are engaged with their teams on a daily basis. So that was the purpose of onboarding the team leads the way that we did. And yes, we did discuss the usual myths, and I don't know if you recognize some of them. I'm sure that you have both recognized some of the obstacles that they experienced here at One.com, but also some of these myths. One of the biggest one, Kanban is just a board. And let me just point out to one of the things that we discussed during the onboarding of the team leads. One of the team leads say, well, I already know what Kanban is, and that's not really for us. And what I said in this connection was, let me go through what Kanban is. And then afterwards, when we talked about the building blocks and the principles and the practices, just on the high level, then let's talk about what Kanban is and whether you think it might be a good idea to try and implement it. And by the way, just to give you the answer to that question, it was yes. This team lead, I really appreciated that. He said, well, I thought I knew what Kanban was, but I realize now that actually I didn't. So now the teams were onboarded, and now we were also on top of what the VP had said, on top of what the management team had said. We also wanted the team leads' opinions on the obstacles that they would like to see removed. What they were bothered about were, for instance, detailed estimates. They were requested from upper level management, and that was very time consuming because they wanted a bullseye estimate and they wanted to know exactly when can we expect the deadline for delivery to be. These estimates, they were quite optimistic sometimes, and maybe it's because it looked as if the teams would be more efficient if they said, hey, no problem, we'll do that in no time. But what they found was that the quality was compromised because these deadlines, when they got closer to the deadlines and they realized, oops, we cannot do everything we want to do, it was the quality that was suffering. And then it appeared later on that these deadlines were in fact arbitrary dates. There was a lack of transparency, and then nobody had the full picture. And often decisions were made based on gut feelings or crystal balls or best guesses. And as I mentioned before, it was every stakeholder for himself. But the full picture of what was going on, that was missing. And because this transparency was lacking and nobody had the full picture, there was sometimes a lack of trust between the teams and their stakeholders because they found estimates you can't trust the estimates, you can't trust the deadlines. The team leads also said that the shifting priorities, I explained about that before, reprioritization, escalations, and all the rest of it, that and too much work in progress, that resulted in context switching. And it was not easy to see what the status was because the environment was very volatile. And now step 2 was finished, mobilization complete. And this is what came out of it. Everyone was on the same page and we had a shared purpose and shared goals, joint understanding of why to go Kanban. And there was also an agreement that we would assess the progress, we would measure the progress continuously from day one. We wanted to improve the lead times by 10%. I talked about that before. But what came on top, we wanted to reduce the overburdening in the development team or in the development teams, and also increase stakeholder satisfaction. And everybody was looking for transparency. So that was also one of the big goals that we had, increased transparency. Now we had shaped the change journey, and now we are going to look at how we executed the transformation. At first, following these mobilization workshops, we continued with the training activities. This was Kanban training, very heavy on the theory, but if you don't understand what Kanban is, how can you work with it? So that was something that was necessary, but the participants, they slept well after that day of training. Then one day, board design workshop, starting with a Kanban simulation. I guess that maybe some of you know the Get Kanban game. It's quite fun and teams are competing against one another. So that was a good way to get some Kanban under your skin. Then we continued with a static exercise, and the result of all this, it was their initial downstream board, knowing that, of course, the first Kanban board is probably not the last. So now we have all teams up and running, but that's of course not the end of story. What did we face here? One of the things was that they were working with Jira, and they had made some wonderful physical boards with a lot of visualization techniques in use, but how did they make this work in Jira? They spent quite some time and used quite a bit of imagination to figure out how can we make this work. I had introduced them to upstream and downstream thinking, and I know it's something that you usually maybe do at a later maturity stage, but to my experience, people find it really logical to work this way. It made perfectly good sense to the teams too, but what about the stakeholders? They were used to just coming with new tasks, new work to the teams. What would they say about this upstream thinking? And what about upper level management? They were not onboarded either. Uh, Here we go. I'd also introduced class of service, and I know that the maturity level was still low, but again, it makes perfectly good sense to people that some work is more important than other work, and that should also be part of making a pool decision uh, depending on the class of service. I also intended to focus on blockers and dependencies because that is they are the major flow stoppers, as I call it, and also on ticket and blocker aging. I did realize that there was a risk of me taking Kanban too far too soon, but I thought, hey, let's try it out and see what happens. But if we look at the before and after scenarios here at one.com, what did we do to overcome the obstacles? And I have talked about what the obstacles were, and let's now look at what we did to solve it. Common way of working, we introduced Kanban upstream and downstream. Unpredictability in service delivery, which caused satisfaction. As I mentioned before, all teams, they started measuring lead times, looking at historic data to make forecasts as to what they were able to achieve in the future. The many different stakeholders leading to unaligned prioritization. We started to involve all stakeholders in replenishment, and actually it worked. I'm going to talk a bit about that later as well. But it meant that the priorities were aligned and the escalations disappeared, and people also understood, which was quite a surprise, but they all understood that tasks could in fact be discarded. Unpredictability, it also moved a bit, it moved away because now we had openness and transparency in replenishment. So everybody knew what was being worked on, and the pressure that the teams often faced with stakeholders coming to them and say, work on my stuff, I can see you're doing something else. That also went away. Wait times for shared resources, that was also fixed by allocating certain testers for certain teams. Before, who did the testing, that was completely at random. That depended on where the work landed. But now they agreed to allocate certain testers to particular teams, and they were participating in all meetings, which meant that they were perfectly well aware that in not very long time from now, I will receive this task that I need to test. And that means that priorities were now aligned, and it reduced wait times for testing dramatically. And unclear requirements, guesswork, and rework, we introduced the definition of ready, which is probably known to everyone here. But that was forcing the stakeholders to provide the needed information. And that was a way to protect the team from doing stuff that nobody needed. And continuing this, obstacle number 7, the detailed estimation, that was completely given up. These bullseye estimates, they were replaced with forecasts based on lead time, and it proved that those forecasts were quite a bit more accurate than the old estimates used to be. I mentioned that the estimates were overly optimistic, but they were no longer necessary, and the focus has shifted to flow instead, flow and lead times. And having the quality being compromised, that was fixed by introducing a definition of done. Again, that's an example of explicit rules, but it works, at least when you take it seriously, and the teams did. Transparency began to rise, and it, of course, that enabled better decision making. You can make robust decisions based on facts instead of based on assumptions, as it used to be. There was a lot of guessworks before. The shifting priorities and too much WIP. The fact that we now have managed replenishment and aligned priorities, that meant that there was no need to shift. There was no need to change the priorities because you were already aligned around them. And the fact that WIP limits were now in place meant that the team got used to completing something before starting something new. And then on top of that, class of service, which also made the teams make well-informed pull decisions. And not knowing the status and the efficiency, again, with higher transparency, it's much easier to have a discussion with stakeholders, with management, or whoever else, because status in all teams it was now visible and known to everybody, and that it turns around the discussions and the conversations completely. So what did they measure? Well, at this time, I don't have any precise lead time data, but lead times, they were measured and they are measured, and the team leads are almost not exactly as we speak, but these days they're trying to look at how can they use lead time more actively. We also measured throughput, and they still do, also number of blockers, because they wanted to see the trend and see if they could fix something in the system to reduce the number of blockers, and the number of expedites as well, also to see the trends, because before people had they were inclined to expedite stuff because they thought they would get things faster, but they wanted to get rid of that way of thinking. But the high focus on flow and also introducing the WIP limits, that did automatically result in higher throughput and also reduce the amount of work of nearly done, which I guess is known to most people. but nearly done stuff is absolutely worth nothing. Only completed stuff is worth anything. And also, they can see now that higher initial quality, and this was facilitated by their definition of ready and done, it also had a positive effect on what they call implementation time. And I interpret it as something like customer lead time, from the time it took from the customer place an order until that person has it in his or her hands. And they will be working with lead time data more actively moving forward. But they still measure, and they did it from day one. I'm not going to go through this definition of ready. This is just an example from one of the teams. But the purpose of showing it is that they were really, really focused on making sure that they were doing the right things and not starting something that wouldn't produce any value. And that's why they were so focused on not allowing anything in their downstream system to prevent rework. And at the other end of their downstream system, they had their definition of done. And again, this is just an example, but this was to protect quality, and they really did take it seriously. And I guess that was just so wonderful to see, because in many, many cases, I've seen teams make the definition already, make the definition of done, and then they put it in a drawer, never to use it again. But here it was used actively, and it did make a significant change. So let me talk a bit about how we measured. And I mentioned the practice assessment tool that we are using in Agile Agenda. And that is based on the KMM and the sub-practices in that wonderful book. We were looking at all the 6 general practices, and it consists of an introduction to this assessment. And time doesn't allow to go into any details with this, but this was an introduction, so people knew what they were looking at when they were looking at the assessment. And there was a summary page where you could see all the highlights from a single team, the result of the complete assessment, which was done practice by practice. And you will recognize the maturity level 1 and transition 1 to 0, or 0 and 0 to 1 transition, then 1, then transition to 2, and so on, so forth. And you can see the number of sub-practices growing as maturity grows. And that assessment goes on through all the 6 general practices. And here you can see an example from one of the teams where on the spider web you can see, okay, there are areas where we are a bit thin and we need to focus on improving what goes on. In this case, for instance, visualization. And you can see to the left here that there are a number of improvement points. So while doing this assessment, the outcome of the assessment is an agreement on what improvement points do we want to work with. If it was something that was very easy, there might be a couple, or there might be 3. If it was something a bit more complicated, they might go for just 1 improvement. And there was nobody telling the teams what to work with or how many things to work with. It was entirely up to them. And there's also, as you can see, a comments and notes field here where they could say, okay, assessment number 3, and some certain points that they wanted to place there as reminders. And then in the middle, you can see maturity in the different general practices areas. And again, this is just a brief overview of what this assessment contains. But it was a really good tool for them to find out, okay, what are the next improvement steps that we could take, and what would be a good idea to work with. So you could set the goal, and there would always be a next goal and a next goal and a next goal, and they would be the ones setting that goal. And on that note, I just want to add that in some teams it was just the team lead and I that did the assessment, and in other teams all team members were participating. So that was entirely context specific, had to do with the culture in the team and the way that they were working, and that's fine. as long as they play along and work according to the changes that the team leads and I had decided would be a good idea to implement. So what else did we achieve? This was indeed a team effort, but one of the things that I often see, and you may recognize it as well, sometimes there is a fear of transparency, and indeed there is a fear of measuring. And that was the case here as well. There were some of the team members that thought that all those metrics is because the management want to see that we are busy and that we are doing enough work, but they very rapidly found out that measuring stuff is actually a help to helping themselves. And being transparent, it's also a big step to take if you're used to just sitting and working with your own stuff, and all of a sudden you're asking people to show everybody what's happening. That can be quite provoking to some people, but that fear was removed completely. And then one very important thing here, the team leads, they were empowered to take responsibility. And that's something you hear in many agile teams. Yeah, we are empowered, we have empowered teams, but they were really empowered. And they also took the responsibility that came with that. They took it really seriously and they were extremely ambitious. And on that note, the management team, they supported everything they did, or everything the team leads did, meaning that even if they saw that something might go slightly wrong, they didn't remove that empowerment from the team leads. They let them handle stuff themselves. So I thought it was absolutely great to see that it actually works when you really mean business when you're talking about empowerment. And the high focus in stakeholder management, it also increased the understanding of each other's situation, both when you were looking from the stakeholder point of view on the teams and from the teams to the stakeholders. And the transparency as well, all of a sudden, everybody could see what was going on. And that resulted in an increased trust. I just talked about the maturity assessment, and that was introduced very soon after we started this transformation. When we started, and again, this was a feeling, the maturity level was approximately 0.5. It wasn't the case that they weren't doing anything. They were doing something, therefore 0.5. But when I ended my work in the organization, the teams had moved to level 2. And also the coach focus that I talked a bit about before, that meant that this implementation would be sustainable. When I left the organization, the team leads would be perfectly capable of moving on their own. I also have some actual numbers for you from one of the teams. One of the things they were looking at was expedites. And here we have just a period from week 40 in 2023 to week 2 here in 24. And compared to the same period the year before, the number of expedites went down from 19 to 1. That's quite significant. And one of the reasons is in this point 2, handling of defects. They used to be expedited all the time, but now they were analyzed and people were trying to see, is this something that we need to expedite, or should we prioritize it in the normal workflow? That made the number go down. And also managing the bug queue, and I find that very interesting that before 2 full-time resources were allocated to handling bugs, but now they are a work item type, and those 2 resources are spending approximately 1.5 hours per day on bug handling. That's a significant decrease that frees time for these people to go and work on something new that can produce value. And the same goes, the emphasis on quality, meaning that the number of defects go down, and that freed up time for maintenance, meaning that the system would be more stable. You wouldn't see so many, it's not that things went down all the time. It did once in a while, but now it has freed up time for maintenance, so you experience it less often, meaning that time is free to do new work, value creation. And also the joint prioritization, I was talking about the stakeholders being part of a stakeholder management meeting. Now, instead of prioritizing work with each of those stakeholders, everybody is sitting in the same meeting. And it is a more robust way of prioritizing, but it also frees up meeting time to do all stuff, other stuff. So now efficiency gains they started to materialize. Feedback from the stakeholders. It's transparent what's going on and who's working on what. They sign out user stories and they decide what to start themselves. And they found that very positive. And they also didn't really have a problem with adhering to definition of ready because it makes sense. They also understood that it protected the quality. And also why rework was so immensely costly, and therefore do make an effort to describe what you really want to do, because rework is a lost opportunity to deliver something that's valuable to them instead of just having to do something all over again. And they also understood that it takes time to handle the work upstream, and also that sometimes you have to discard something. That's easier to understand when you can see what's going on and can evaluate what else is on the board and can say, okay, this is my idea, but I realize it's actually not as good as these other people's ideas. So that was also a significant change. Planning forecasts instead of estimates, I talked about that, completely accepted, and time showed that those forecasts were more accurate. They also loved increased quality, and they also accepted that instead of having this bullseye deadline, they now could see what was going on in the system and could see that quality work would be delivered as soon as possible. And last but not least, gold plating stuff is not always the best idea. So they also understood that insisting that we need to have a Rolls-Royce solution, that's not really the best way of using scarce resources. That's what the stakeholders, they realized themselves. Feedback from the team members and the team leads. Introducing WIP limits had been a very, very important reason why stress was removed and the work environment became calmer. There was a possibility to focus, and that was not the name of the game before Kanban. They also found that their efficiency had increased because there was not so much task switching. They actually enjoyed that, and they also took a professional pride in being more efficient and also being more predictable. And the fact that these explicit policies had helped the collaboration between departments, and that had reduced wait time and increased flow, that also made them proud because they could see that their stakeholders were having, they got more stuff sooner. And then the best of all was that they didn't have to estimate anymore. They could spend their time on doing real work. Less push from stakeholders, and also focus on visualizing blockers that actually resulted in updated processes and procedures, because now analyzing those blockers, they could see where they occurred, and they could see what was something in our system that we can fix. And they did go and fix them by updating their processes and procedures. But this change journey, there's still much more you could do if you wanted to. This was a pilot. It only covered 2 countries. You might make it cover more countries. You might also involve other business managers, because here we were only in one business unit. We haven't involved the C-level yet. So that means that you can only go so far when only part of the organization is onboarded. And the fact that the team that work with Kanban, the teams that work with Kanban, as well as their stakeholders, they all of a sudden have all this nice transparency. They sometimes get frustrated that, why aren't everybody on board on this Kanban journey? Because it would make it so much easier. So they are ready for step 6, and that was challenge the status quo. They are ready for it. So let's see what happens. Maybe the organization is ready for it sometime in the future. I hope so, but let's see what happens. And now it's time for a brief summary. The conclusions here, we couldn't have achieved this in such a short period without the constant support from the management team. I touched upon it before, but had they not been supporting us all along, it would not have been possible. Also, insisting on measuring progress, that meant that everybody had the goals in focus. We want to achieve maturity level 2. We want to be more efficient. We want to have shorter lead times, etc. So the fact that you are measuring and you have a particular goal meant that everybody knew exactly where we are trying to go. And again, the team leads were instrumental to making this happen. They were very ambitious and they were very much interested in the Kanban method, and they dug in and they asked a lot of questions and they went back to their team. They were really, really doing a wonderful job in making this happen. It's really their effort that made all the difference, I would say, together with the management team, of course, as I mentioned before. It became the way of working. It's just how we do things around here. And everybody demonstrated a will to follow the rules and policies. Maybe I was just lucky, but I do think that the fact that the team leads were so ambitious and the managers were supporting us, that also made the team members understand that, well, this is the way we need to work, and they were just doing it. So leadership at all levels was indeed demonstrated in this company, not in this practice, or it was demonstrated in practice in this company. The team leads, they are familiar with static. So when they want to start up new teams, if that is the case in the future, they can do it themselves. They don't need me for that. They know enough to go ahead and do it themselves. And they can also continue the improvement journey using the maturity assessment. We cannot prove that there's a 10% improvement, but talking to these key people that I was mentioning before from one.com, I asked them, so what do you think? 10% improvement, are we there? Or what do you think? And their feeling was definitely, and it's probably higher. And then what I want to mention here is that we changed the system and not the people. No new teams, no new roles, no new nothing. We did change the system though, and it became quite a bit more efficient. And then I've taken the liberty to, here in the last few slides, in fact, the last slide, to tell you about this basic guide to Kanban that is very shortly going to be available in English as well. I gave it a massive overhaul, so it now includes KMM basics. And if you feel like connecting, please feel free to do so. Scan this QR code. What I do want to mention as a very last thing is the podcast, The Agile Agenda, has a very, very special guest. I had the opportunity, and I'm so glad, I'm so thankful, and I'm so happy that David Anderson took the time to let me interview him for The Agile Agenda. So there's going to be a series of 3 episodes on this podcast show, the first one being published on Friday. And with that, time for questions.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you very much. It was very fruitful. It was very interesting. And yes, we have a lot of questions. So we have just 4 minutes left. Therefore, I will try to group them and we'll see how much you will be able to answer. So maybe the first one, there are a few questions regarding tools. You mentioned that there were challenges with using Jira. Do you have any tips how to?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. I mentioned what?
You mentioned that there were challenges with using Jira.
Yes.
Yes. So do you have any tips for making it better for the Kanban implementations? Like, how did you overcome limits of Jira to make things more visible?
Well, we didn't overcome everything because we just couldn't. But one thing we did that proved to be very efficient was that actually it was one of the team leads that came up with the idea to introduce a swim lane with explicit rules above each of the columns. And that was quite brilliant because here definition of ready, definition of done, and pull criteria, what needs to be in place before you can pull something from one column to the next. That was really a stroke of genius, in my opinion. And then we were trying to figure out how can we use tags, how can we use colors, etc., to at least get as much visualization techniques in place so it would ooze as much information as possible. I guess that's what I'm able to say here.
Okay, so in junction with that, like how was definition of ready communicated to stakeholders, and how was definition of done implemented, and were there any
How
specific
was,
tools that, can
how,
you hear me?
sorry, how was the what?
How was definition of ready communicated to
Oh,
stakeholders, and how
yeah.
was definition of done implemented? Did you use any specific tools to remind the teams about the definitions and, let's say, encourage them to
No,
follow them?
everybody adopted the idea with introducing this swim lane with explicit rules. And every new work that was coming into the team was kind of assessed according to the definition of ready. And if something was missing, they would go back to the stakeholders and say, hey, we need information in this area. You haven't informed us about this. Please give us this information. We can't start this work until you give us this information. And the definition of done, it was more for the team itself as a kind of a checklist that, yes, we have completed all development. Yes, we have done all the testing that we agreed that we needed to do when we looked at the definition of ready, so on and so forth. Uh, so
Okay,
that was how we worked with it in reality.
thank you. Another question: did you communicate and explain the concept of maturity levels at the beginning? How did they adapt it?
Yeah, I did. And what I tried to do is that this is not this is you don't need to chase anything in particular. The important thing is that you understand where you are. So I said that I usually I use the picture that I'm putting up a mirror in front of you so you can see this is where we are. And you can decide, is this good enough for us or do we want to move further? In this case, I mean, the goal was already set. Our ambition was to go to maturity level 2. So that was kind of a given. But we introduced this maturity model, and I explained that there's not a good or a right or the best maturity. The maturity is what it is, but you need to decide where do you want to go. And it's up to you to do whatever you want.
Mhm. We are running out of time, so Annette, please let me know if you have like time for another one or two questions. And of
Yeah,
course, our
I don't
participants.
have any problem. And by the way, I guess in the contact information, if any of you have any questions that you would like to ask me, feel free to contact me. You're welcome to doing that.
Mhm.
I'm happy to answer a few more questions if people have time and want to stay along.
All right, so let's go through them. Who from the team was responsible for taking care of the next improvements and following up on the completed improvements? Um, like meaning there was a driver like team leader, or that was a specific assigned for that? And also how often they need to reassess their maturity levels?
We had the team leads, I guess I called them change agents as well. And you know, in Kanban, we are talking about service delivery management and service request management. We didn't really introduce those roles because the team leads, the role of the team lead was so well integrated in the organization, so there was no need to change that. And they took on the responsibility to take care of flow in the downstream board. The maturity assessments, and thank you for the questions, by the way, they're really good questions. The maturity assessments, we did those once every month, so there would be time enough to work with the improvements that they had decided to work with. But in case they hadn't completed them when we did the next assessment, well, so be it. It's not like something bad would happen or somebody would be controlling anything. It's a matter of, yeah, again, showing leadership at all levels. And if you are serious about what you're doing, and if you are ambitious, and if you are working in a Kanban setting, continuous improvement is natural, and it became natural. And it was the team leads that were kind of owning the maturity assessments, and it was the team leads that were discussing with their own teams. Sometimes I was involved as well when there were questions, and sometimes they had piled together questions that where the team leads were kind of in doubt. So I was involved. I didn't mind that at all. But it was the team leads that owned the assessments and were responsible for working with their teams to achieve the improvements.
So last question for today, and apologies for anyone whose questions were not answered today. Please feel free to reach out to Annette. Last question will be like a summary for you. If you could start over this project, what would you have done differently?
Yeah, and that's a good question too, because yeah, every transformation is different, and there wasn't that many things that I would do over again. But I think that I would be more clear on decomposing tasks. What does that mean? And what are we measuring when we are measuring lead times? How small do they need to be? How big do they need to be? We ended up agreeing that it needs to be customer recognizable, something that kind of smelled like a user story, something in that neighborhood. But that was a topic that we discussed quite often. And if I could do something over again, I think that I would have been more clear in my messages instead of kind of leaving it up to the teams to determine what are the right things to measure. I guess that's what I would do differently. But I think I've been very, very fortunate indeed in this project, because again, I had full management support, I had full team lead support, and the team leads, they were doing a wonderful job working with their stakeholders. So this was, I mean, it's important to say that what we achieved here is not because everybody was, and I think that that's an expression that David Anderson uses sometimes. We are not talking about a whole organization full of Lionel Messis here. We are talking about developers, clever testers, good people all along, but they were just a company like you often meet companies with good people all along. So it's not like they were particularly brilliant at everything they did, but what they were particularly brilliant at was to adopt the Kanban thinking and to say, okay, I might not understand it entirely from the beginning, but hey, let's do it and see what happens. And then they saw the results, and then as time moved along, the understanding grew, and then things started to really move fast. But I think I've been very lucky to have been part of this implementation, and I'm so thankful to One.com that they involved me, and also so thankful to the team leads for all their nice collaboration, and also in their helping with making this presentation.
Thank you very much, Annette. It was great. It was a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for all attendance. Hope
Yeah,
to
you're
see
welcome.
you again in classrooms, in
Me
webinars, in
too.
conferences. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be there. I'm sure that I'll be meeting some of you out there in the Kanban space. So thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.